All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Cultish, Entering the Kingdom of the Cults. My name is Jeremiah Roberts. I'm one of the co-hosts here. I am not joined today by Super Sleuth Andrew. He is a bit under the weather, so he is taking a break today, getting some much-needed rest. So, however, I am super excited because we are going to be talking about a fun topic today. I am here in the studio with Sarah Adent. How are you?
Doing great. Excited to be here.
Yes. And so we have kind of a story together. I've known you and your husband for a while. You are from Oregon, and so I met you right around the time when we started Cultish, and you brought up the topic of Bigfoot and the fact that this is an area that you just, whenever I talk to you about it, you get excited about it. So I figured this is sort of a fun interim episode. We have it where it's kind of towards the end of the year. We'll be dropping this around 2022. So I thought this would be a good sort of introductory topic, as kind of going into the areas of the fringe, the supernatural, and all that. But yeah, so you had quite the interest in Bigfoot, and so I said, sometime we got to get you on to kind of like talk about it. So here we are. It's finally happened. So are you excited?
I definitely am. Yeah.
Okay. So real quick, we're going to introduce our guest in a second, but you are from Oregon, and that area is known for Bigfoot as a whole, correct?
Yeah. So really the Pacific Northwest, Washington, Oregon, California, that's kind of considered like the hot spot for Bigfoot sightings, though they are seen throughout the U.S., but...
Okay.
Yeah.
So how, you yourself personally, like how did you is this something that you just sort of got into, your friends were into it, or like what got you into, even though you're in that area, there's plenty of people who probably are into other things besides Bigfoot.
Yeah.
Up in, I mean, obviously there's the whole segment, Keep Portland Weird and all that stuff. So, but anyways, like how did you get into that?
Definitely. So, really what got me interested in it is my whole family kind of has had experiences with Bigfoot, namely my dad, my grandma, my uncle. My grandma lived in a cabin in the remote wilderness in the Portland metro area, and she had experiences with it on her property. And I remember as a kid going up to the cabin and staying there and, going by the campfire and them sharing the stories and everything. So it really kind of has been something that my family has always talked about. And I mean, the idea of it is super fascinating. Okay, excellent. Well, I'm excited to unpack it, and we're going to go into the history, because you would say that this is a story of you and your family. This is indicative of one of many sightings that people have seen all throughout the world. I mean, it seems to be in some specific geographical locations, but there are tons of people who had, you would say, similar experience. Do the typical sightings you see, do they line up with what you and your family experienced? Yeah. So when it comes to like Sasquatch sightings, there's remarkable consistency between reports, and they're seen largely in like heavily wooded areas, like obviously Oregon, Washington and stuff, but they're seen throughout the U.S., like in Florida, the South,
Okay.
They have different names for it, though. Like in the South, they'll call it the skunk ape. And again, that kind of goes with the legend of Bigfoot. All throughout the world, there's different names for something that seems to be the same thing that people are seeing. Okay, definitely. Well, I appreciate you kind of introducing that. And so I want to go ahead and introduce our other guest. So if you have all listened into Cultish the last couple of years, you may be familiar with our guest. He's made a couple of appearances. Dr. Ray Boeche, welcome back to Cultish. It's good to talk to you again.
Jeremiah, good to be here. And good to be here with Sarah as well.
Yeah, so I'm really intrigued to kind of unravel this conversation as we kind of like look into what's really a fascinating subject. Just tell them just a little bit about yourself and what interests you about the subject of Bigfoot.
I've been a paranormal researcher since 1965. Investigated my first local Bigfoot sighting here in Nebraska in 1968. I've been a pastor for 30 plus years, theologian by training, artist by profession. And I've been investigated all aspects of the paranormal for decades now, and find it very intriguing. In the late 80s, decided what was sorely lacking in the world as a whole was a Christian viewpoint of the paranormal.
Yeah.
All topics in the paranormal.
Oh, definitely. I could not agree with you more. And I think that's that's part of the conversation that we kind of really brought up when we did our episodes on the UFO phenomena, which we're going to continue to explore that topic in 2022. And this episode should be released in 2022 as well. Is just that it seems that people tend, when it comes to the supernatural and the fringe, people tend to, you can tell me if you agree with me or not, it seems that people tend to put it in two different categories. They'll look at it strictly through the physical evidence, or they'll they'll fill in the blanks and they'll try and only view it through the lens of the supernatural, or even sometimes even from a Christian perspective or Christian worldview. I think there's a level in which, especially in the Western world, we've only take what we can see with our physical eyes, and we almost sort of get into this reverse Gnosticism, ignoring or just sort of discounting any sort of supernatural or spiritual explanation to some of this phenomena. So I think it's good to like have a view of both as we look into this. I think there are some similarities too with the conversation surrounding Sasquatch and Bigfoot and all that.
Yeah, I think post-Enlightenment, Western society, Western culture as a whole has become increasingly materialistic and physicalistic.
Yeah.
Science has become a cultic religion all its own, and materialism is its main tenet. I prefer, when I'm speaking to a group of people, to refer to these things as the paranormal, which you as a pastor and have studied Greek, you know that what paranormal means, alongside the normal.
Mm-hmm.
And so these things happen, and they happen consistently. They happen on a very regular basis. And we are existing in a physical dimension, if you want to put it that way. And alongside us is a spiritual dimension, which is exactly the Christian worldview. And these things, for wherever they come from, however they do it, tend to cross over from their normal into our normal.
Yeah.
And so we have this interchange between the two, between the paranormal or supernatural, if you prefer that, and the physical world.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. And I have a question too, and maybe you can pack this and answer. Anytime you have any questions too, you can definitely jump in as we go into the conversation. But I'm curious about too, in our episode, Ray, with when we were talking about the initial one, we're talking about making the connections between the world of the UFOs and the world of the occult. There seemed to be, from that conversation, there was a connection in regards to UFO sightings with a lot of what happened with the different research that different government organizations were doing, including people like Jack Parsons and others who were kind of trying to look at the occult, saying, how can we actually use this and how can we potentially weaponize this? And just that sort of involvement to all of a sudden these sightings started happening, specifically from the 1950s. I think some were a little bit pre-1950s, but that it seemed to be the later part of the 20th century when these sightings started to become really normalized. And you even look at now where something like just the whole UFO discussion seemed to be such a fringe topic for the longest time. And here, now you have it being normalized. It was, we were talking, there was a pulse of the conversation where all the news media outlets were talking about these major, UFO disclosures, which it's kind of anticlimactic, but the point being that it's now, what was the fringe is now part of our cultural conversation. So in regards to Bigfoot, Ray, share with us from your perspective, when did this start to kind of really take root, like especially in American culture? Because for me, just so you know too, my first exposure to Bigfoot was a kid when I watched the movie and the show Harry and the Hendersons. So that was my point of reference. So, it's everyone kind of has some sort of introduction to these topics, typically through film or sometimes just through something a friend shares with them. But when did you start taking interest in this? And like, what's your knowledge of when this started really become a cultural phenomenon in some sense?
You know, I became interested even in grade school with the idea of, first, the abominable snowman, the Yeti.
Yeah.
One of the first books I read was by Ivan Sanderson, a British zoologist, called On the Trail of the Abominable Snowman. And is sort of the standard reference work on the Yeti. Mm-hmm. I became interested with that. And then as Bigfoot sightings began to crop up, they became relatively newsworthy, I guess you could call it, in the late 50s mm-hmm. in Northern California. And that began to get a little bit of public notice. I think it really caught the public's attention in 1968, 69, when the Patterson-Gimlin film was released. That's the sort of iconic footage of Bigfoot walking across a creek bed in California.
Oh, yeah.
Most everyone has seen that. And if you, someone has actually gone to the trouble of rendering the film into 4K and stabilizing the image so that the image of the creature stays. And so it's a remarkable piece of film. And if you look for the stabilized Patterson-Gimlin film,
yes,
do a search for that and you'll find it. The presence of these things, though, goes back, I would have to say, really into the mists of time, because you can find early American newspaper accounts of people encountering a wild man in the woods. You go back even further into Native American lore, and you have virtually every tribe, no matter where they are, has a Bigfoot-like character. In the Nebraska region, which was eventually populated mainly by the Sioux, but the Arapaho and Cheyenne were all in here at one time or another. But the Sioux have a creature they refer to as the hairy man. And they will, even now, on the reservations, parents will tell their kids, you better get to bed or the hairy man will get you. Mm-hmm. So he's becoming kind of like the boogeyman figure, but it's very much a part of Native American culture. Same thing in Europe. You can go back into the oldest written accounts, and you'll find these stories of people encountering wild men in the woods, hairy, big people. Mm-hmm. And it's ubiquitous around the world. Different names, different situations, but I think they've always been with us.
Mm-hmm. No, that's good. Do you have any questions? What are your thoughts so far with what he's saying? You mentioned, as soon as he mentioned that footage, you confirmed it there, like you're nodding. So I know you did your research. What are your thoughts so far?
Yeah. So in regards to the Patterson-Gimlin video, that video has been scrutinized for years, and it hasn't actually been able to be disproved, because when you look at the way that whatever is in that film is walking, the physical gait and how it's lifting its foot and the posture of its leg is something that goes beyond what a human would be capable of doing.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, it's fascinating. They've actually done some studies with athletes with body motion sensors on them. The human body cannot move the way that creature does. Mm-hmm. It's anatomically impossible. So, it really puts the lie to the idea that this is a guy in a gorilla suit.
Right. Yeah. In fact, I remember watching some footage, some sort of Bigfoot documentary. We had, it was when I was going to high school, and we was just kind of close towards the finals around this time of year. And so we just had the time to kill. So our teacher, I can't remember which class I was in, put in some sort of footage, and we had that, it was a tape Back then we had video cassettes. I'm so old. Back in the late 90s. So put in a video cassette of some Bigfoot documentary, and they had that footage of that tape. I remember as soon as we saw that, we were all laughing. Just because like, that's the fakest thing I've ever seen. It kind of has that same sort of camera shutter speed, almost you think about like the JFK assassination. There's almost sort of that point of reference. But, it's interesting. You can give me your thoughts on this too, is that while I think sometimes the initial gut instinct is to kind of maybe say, oh, that's fake. Well, how many points of reference what's your ultimate point of reference? You're only interpreting for what you view, like, your other points of reality. And so we're associating that with some sort of gorilla or some sort of human. But if it's moving in a way that's a little bit different, a little bit off, just because it's moving in a way that we don't fully understand doesn't necessarily mean that it's fake.
Right.
Okay. Definitely. And so definitely another question I have too, because there are some examples too, and maybe we can turn back the clock further, because we'll get into some ideas of American sightings too, is that in regards to just the story of Bigfoot, you mentioned it's sort of being told in folklore, even in earlier times, and especially in the early Americas. If you think about just everything in regards to just especially in the Eastern cultures, is very word of mouth. And so when you look at a lot of the other sort of mythical creatures, and you think about, the ideas of dragons, unicorns, mermaids, werewolves, fairies, even like the Loch Ness Monster, which kind of has a similar component to Bigfoot. And, you look at like the centaurs and even like vampires and werewolves. I think I mentioned that there's seems to be a commonality to where like that mythology is coming from somewhere. And usually back then, back in ancient times, you would have, it wasn't word of mouth. We didn't go around with cameras, and we didn't have this independent line of witness and testimony. A lot of it would just be, what did our patriarchs experience? And it would just be tales of what they experienced. But you do see kind of a phenomena or retelling of stories through time. Do you kind of see like a similarity to that, Ray, in regards to kind of like the mythical stories that are just kind of there, that we all kind of collectively know? I mean, it's part of who we are. But do you see a connection to that in regards to kind of the story of Sasquatch and Bigfoot? Is there a similarity there?
Well, I think it goes without saying. If you look at, if you mention to most people the idea of the biblical flood,
right?
They're like, oh, well, that's just it's a myth, it's a story, it's a localized tradition. Until you start to look historically and anthropologically around the world, and virtually every culture has a flood story. Yeah, including Native Americans. So it's these events that we, because of our materialistic bent, want to just toss off and ignore. When we start to look at it, there becomes evident a deep, rich vein of historical instances that bolster those ideas. And I think it's the same thing with Bigfoot and Sasquatch. Mm-hmm. I was privileged to design a book for the Confederated Salish tribes in Montana about their encounter with the Lewis and Clark expedition. Uh-huh. And as I got to sit down with some of the tribal elders and ask them about their version of Sasquatch, and it kind of got literally from one of the tribal elders the sort of inside story on their idea of the Sasquatch. Mm-hmm. And it was fascinating. But the incredible thing about that, one of the anthropologists who was working with the tribe has noticed their oral history. And how their oral history literally goes back hundreds, and as far as we can determine, thousands of years, accurately describing changes that happened in the Bitterroot Valley in Montana. Mm-hmm. And so, people tend to say, well, oral traditions are just stories. No, oral traditions are the truths of a people, the truth of their experiences that's been handed down orally. And because this predates their ability to write.
Mhm.
This is their way of maintaining their culture and their history. And so the accuracy of oral history is impeccable in many, many cases. And so I don't think we can discount it. We have to give it an adequate hearing and examine it against the evidence that we have physically to prove or disprove these things.
Okay. No, definitely. And in fact, it's interesting too, the connection that Ray just mentioned too, just about in regards to oral tradition and in regards to folklore, and then it is with your family telling these stories about these encounters.
Mm-hmm.
So that's definitely interesting. I'm just curious too, because you mentioned that as far as your lineage, don't you have some, like, aren't you like part Native American?
Yeah, so I'm part Native American, Lakota Sioux tribe. My great-grandmother is full Native American, so my grandma's half. So I think that definitely plays a part in, I guess, belief in Sasquatch and having those stories passed down.
Okay. I'm curious as well too, because in regards just to Native American spirituality, there always is the aspect of, there is, the occult is the occult when it comes to doing certain practices to try and attain secret, esoteric, hidden knowledge from the beyond or into another dimension that God forbids and condemns in Deuteronomy 18. But it's always different depending on the culture. So India has the occult that's unique to them. You have it, in New Orleans, it's got the very, that Louisiana folklore that's very unique to that culture. And even when we did the episode with a pastor from West Virginia who unexpectedly did a deliverance, there's a unique folklore from there too. But in regards to Native American spirituality, think of like the dream catcher and what that's for, to alter the spirit realm. I mean, from any of your research, do you see any sort of connections in regards to the Indian burial grounds or anything that happens in connection to these Sasquatch sightings? Because again, we're approaching this from, I think there's a realm that's physical, but if we're going to make the case what some people say is interdimensional, then there is some level in which it's inherently spiritual. Maybe the things go together. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, in regards to like Native Americanism, that's a culture that is steeped in, mysticism and things that obviously as Christians we would condemn and say that is not the truth. But when it comes to Sasquatch, I think that there is a supernatural component to this.
Okay. Well, just off the get-go, like what would be your instinctive just to make that case? Because if you think about it, if you want to, our lines of testimony and witness has to be 2 to 3 independent lines of testimony. I think the challenge is too, Ray, and you've dealt with this with the research that you do, is the reality that we see the world, our naked eye does not as a whole see the unseen realm. We have things sometimes, as Christians, say you're in a situation where you're ministering or, you're doing evangelism and that you kind of have a gut instinct. It's hard to describe that there's something deeper going on. And ultimately, evangelism and what you do in ministry always is inherently both physical and spiritual. But you can always sense when there's something going on. Like, how would you make that determination just from your research of Bigfoot? Like what makes you instinctively come to that conclusion?
I think that a lot of people that see this creature, like we were mentioning earlier, report things that are unexplainable, like it disappearing or them having a really bad feeling when they do see it.
Yeah. Is that that would be just the instinctive things that come to mind?
I suppose maybe Ray might be able to speak better on this.
Yeah, Ray, could you elaborate on that? Because I think what's interesting too, I think, and again, I'm not the most knowledgeable person on the subject, but when you look, for example, the people who get into UFOs typically lead to further research and typically lead to attempted alien contact, and which ends up leading you to certain occultic practices. So you look at the CE5 disclosures with Dr. Stephen Greer. Just recently, I posted, Demi Lovato has been making the headlines. I just saw something posted over the weekend where she was trying to now go ghost hunting, and she is trying to now sing songs to these paranormal beings to help them because they had some sort of they were oppressed and had trauma. And she's being genuine, being sincere, but a lot of her initial spirituality and what she believes now is that she was working directly with Dr. Stephen Greer, doing specifically CE5 disclosures. For anyone who doesn't know, those are called Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. And we even mentioned Stephen Greer has an app where you can do this. And Ray, I appreciate the fact that in our initial episode you mentioned, don't download the app, don't use it, but there's an inherent path to spirituality that seems to always be the case many a times with UFOs. When it comes to Bigfoot, what similarities do you see in regards to making a case that it isn't just a physical creature, there might be something more to this? What are your thoughts on that, Ray?
Surprisingly enough, you mentioned Greer's very ill-conceived idea of essentially having a mediumistic seance in which you call down extraterrestrials.
Mm-hmm.
Once you start to delve into these things, given virtually any topic, you will find people, and this is true in Bigfoot and Sasquatch research. You will find people, and with the internet and self-publishing picking up speed, you will find dozens, if not hundreds, of books of people who claim to psychically communicate with Bigfoot and follow spiritual advice given by Bigfoot, because obviously they're natural creatures, and so they're much closer to the spirits of nature than we are.
Right.
And I mean, so you find people who will do anything to, speaking from a Christian perspective, avoid dealing with the truth of Jesus Christ and Scripture and substitute their own God.
That's good. No, that's a great point, Ray. Sarah, I saw the wheels in your head turning.
Yeah,
so what questions do you have, or what do you think in regards to that?
Well, along with what Ray said, I was going to say that a lot of people that have an encounter with Sasquatch,
mm-hmm.
it's extremely impactful on their life, and it almost leads them to an obsession with it, to trying to uncover and discover the truth. You know, I'm thinking of Tom DeLonge and his obsession with aliens and proving that, you know, dedicating his life to it and proving that to be true. It's almost the same with people that see this thing. They are so profoundly impacted that they go on this quest for truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely think that that could be a tactic that Satan is using to distract people from the truth of the gospel, to make them obsessed with something and discovering that rather than pointing them to Christ.
Okay. Yeah. And so with something like that, you could that's definitely the case, because you're not just making, this is not just some discovery. Oh, I just saw some creature. I saw something I haven't seen before. Like, you know, you go out, if you've never been in some particular area, and I've never seen a moose in real life. And let's just say, I think I have a friend up in Idaho who has seen moose. So you see up there like, oh, that's cool. The first time I've seen one of those, and that's kind of interesting. That's cool. But, you know, you go and move on. So this is the case where you'd say it's not just, I saw this thing, or potentially
this is something
this
that
becomes
isn't supposed to exist.
Right. So even in those cases, like this knowledge and this obsession, it almost becomes a part of your identity, and makes it who you, and really it begins to define who you are as a person. Like this search and this unraveling for truth. If only I had the special knowledge of what I saw, and I'm going to go and unravel that. Because I do have seen the people who get into it. I mean, some of the people who go obsessively search for that stuff, that seems to be the case with them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this, Ray, because in regards to this being an interdimensional being, people coming to those conclusions, that, you know, I think many a times when you're kind of looking at the world of the occult, it's so easy to look for the evil out there, you know, whether it's some sort of interdimensional being, whether it's, you know, people who are secretly conspiring, you know, to do their evil or whatnot, and whether the different secret societies. And so many a times I think we always think about the evil out there, but I think sometimes we don't take into account the evil that is within us, which we have a basis for as Christians. So in regards to like Isaiah chapter 44, verse Isaiah 44, verse 14. This is talking about on some level the nature of idolatry, where says, "Behold, he cuts down cedars, he selects the cypress and the oak, he plants the pine in the forest to be nourished by the rain, and it is used as fuel for burning. Some of it he takes and warms himself, and he kindles a fire and bakes bread. But then he fashions a god and worships it, and makes an idol and bows down to it." So this is a situation where this is talking about a cedar, a tree, and there's nothing inherently evil. God created this for good, and he's utilizing it for good. He's chopping it down, he's using it to make food, but then he takes another portion of it and he makes an idol out of it. So how can I argue the case then, and maybe I can play devil's advocate here? I mean, could we just say that this is just a creature we don't fully understand, that it's just primarily physical, that this is the people coming to it? And I can ask, like, play devil's advocate with you too, Sarah. Is this what's happening when it comes to Bigfoot sightings? They're just happening, and this is talking about the evil and the idolatry that is in one's heart, and making an idol out of this. But just because someone's coming to these conclusions or has these sort of believes they're in tap with something, is that just what's going on within their heart? Or what are you guys' thoughts on that? You kind of feel where I'm going with this?
Yeah, I would say this, and this is a cautionary tale for believers.
Yeah.
It's not actually a cautionary tale, it's a truth. We sometimes want to place the blame for evil outside of ourselves. And so sometimes it becomes easier to blame, for example, a demon. There are people who will deliver you from a spirit of tobacco.
Right.
And so they take the addiction to nicotine and they demonize it. And so suddenly it's not, I have put myself in a position where my body is dependent on a drug that I get from smoking tobacco.
Right.
To, I've been infected by a demon of tobacco, and I need to be delivered from this. The thing we miss, where we miss the mark most widely sometimes, is the fact that Satan is a real entity. Demonic entities are real entities. But the nature of man is to, going all the way back to the Garden of Eden, when we were given the promise that if Eve would eat the fruit, she would know the difference between good and evil, and she would be like God. We all have that nature of wanting to be like God, wanting to be our own gods, wanting to say, this is right for me. I don't care what you think. This is right for me. I'm determining what's right and what's wrong. So that inclination away from God that's in our hearts as humans is always there. And we don't really need, Satan doesn't need to intervene a lot in order to get us to do bad things, because it's in our nature to turn away from God and go in exactly the opposite direction. Are these entities out there? Yes. Are they willing to counterfeit experiences and give the appearance of being beneficial spirits or helpful spirits or nature spirits? Absolutely. But our inclination is to search for those things. So out of, as Paul says in Romans, we chose to worship the creation rather than the creator. And so anytime we look at the natural world and we get obsessed with that's all there is, we've left the path of wisdom and we're following our own hearts that want to lead us away from God.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's good to have a holistic view when we're dealing with the supernatural, because so many, like I said, so many times you're thinking out there, but we have to think holistically. The evil is within us too, except for the grace of God as a whole. In fact, at first I was thinking about just the other day was James chapter 3, verse 14, which says, "If you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not wisdom which comes from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic." So this is talking not about, something about some potential interdimensional being. This is talking about something that all of us deal with on a regular basis. So, how many times have I been bitter, jealous, and have had self-ambition in my heart? I know I have. I'm assuming you have, just a little bit, just a little bit.
Yeah.
But so that's a situation to where, and this is just maybe something to take into practicality as we continue to unravel this, is that this is something we're a lot more likely to deal with on a regular basis than Sasquatch at the end of the day. And obviously, we'll unpack too, like what people actually do with that. But I think that's a great point too. And I think that's something we should always take into account whenever we look at any of this stuff too, whether we're dealing with the aspects of, the complexities of the Nephilim, the relationship, how some people believe that this is descendants of, these are potentially descendants of the Nephilim, and there's connections to Christ coming, and there is a true spiritual war, and that's the big picture. But we do also have to make sure we don't lose track of ourselves to begin with as well too. Mm-hmm. So, did you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, when it comes to things like the paranormal, Sasquatch, aliens, all of that, I mean, it's fascinating to think about, but at the end of the day, the gospel is the most important thing, and people coming to know Christ, and all of these things can end up being distractions if left unchecked. Yeah,
definitely. So Ray, just real quickly, and I know I appreciate being on here, and this is just a general overview. And maybe we can unpack this too as we kind of go into the next episode. So kind of jumping forward, you mentioned that you got into it through some sightings in Nebraska, but you mentioned there's some ones they're pretty famous that kind of really kind of got the cultural conversation going. What were some examples of that? Because you mentioned it took place in the 1970s, and it was in Pennsylvania. You said you mentioned that before the episode.
Oh, there's a sort of a classic case that happened in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, in October of 1973. This was investigated by a man that I had the privilege of calling a friend, Dr. Berthold Schwartz, who was a very well-known psychiatrist and interested in the power of the mind. Mm-hmm. And so he investigated a lot of psychic phenomena, many things, but just a fascinating man and a great scientist. But he investigated this incident that began with a UFO sighting, continued into a UFO landing, and the UFO sighting was by about 15 people. They saw the thing land. They contacted the state patrol, and the state police came to this farm. It was on a rural farm. This object was about 100 feet in diameter, sitting in a pasture. As they were watching this, they saw two creatures walking along a fence line. This thing was very bright and illuminated the area. This was about 9:00 at night. And one of these figures was about 7 feet tall. The other was a little over 8 feet tall. And they were sort of a typical Bigfoot, Sasquatch-like creature. They walked along. They started coming toward a man and two twin boys who were watching them. The guy had brought a 30-06 rifle along with him, and he knew that the first round he had in the chamber was a tracer. And so he fired it over the heads of these two creatures. They were sort of making sounds back and forth to one another, almost like a baby crying. And when they started continuing to come toward them, he fired several shots into the larger one, which then raised an arm, let out a wail, and the two creatures turned around with no apparent effect, from the 30-06 slugs and walked back into the woods. The state patrolman arrives. The object, meanwhile, as soon as he hit one of the creatures, excuse me, the object that had landed in the field disappeared, leaving a 100-foot diameter circle that glowed in the pasture. The state trooper said he believed it was, he could read a newspaper by the glow of this circle.
Was this in the evening? Do you know the time frame in which this sighting took place? You mentioned it was glowing, and I'm assuming if it was in the later evening,
it started about 9 o'clock in the evening.
Okay. And
continued to about 3 o'clock the next morning. The state patrolman was scared out of his mind when they heard a lot of crashing in the woods near where these creatures had gone back into the tree line. He left to go back to the barracks and call a researcher in the area who did UFO research to come out and take a look at what was going on. They got there about midnight or so. And what was fascinating, as they're standing there looking at the scene, and I'll read you a few little excerpts here.
Yeah. From
Dr. Schwartz's report. A bull in a nearby field was scared by something. Stephen, this is the man who had fired at the creatures. Stephen's dog also became alarmed and started tracking something. The dog kept looking at a certain spot by the edge of the woods, but the group didn't see anything. One of the researchers was asking Stephen some questions when suddenly Stephen began rubbing his head and face. The researcher asked him if he was okay, and Stephen then began shaking back and forth as if he were going to faint. The researcher and Stephen's father grabbed Stephen, age 22, 6'2", 250 pounds. He began breathing very heavily and started growling like an animal. He flailed his arms and threw his father and the researcher to the ground. His dog ran towards him then as if to attack, and Stephen went after the dog. The dog started crying. Another researcher said, "I'm starting to feel lightheaded." He became very weak and felt faint. A third researcher began to complain about having trouble breathing. During all this, Stephen, the original percipient and the man who fired the shots, was running around, swinging his arms and loudly growling like an animal. Suddenly, he collapsed on his face into a heavily manured area. Shortly afterwards, he started to come out of it and said, "Get away from me, it's here, get back." Just then, everyone present smelled a very strong sulfur or chemical-like odor. One of the researchers said, "Let's get out of here." Then he and Stephen's father were helping Stephen along when suddenly on the way down the hill, Stephen pointed and yelled, "Keep away from the corner, it's in the corner." Stephen kept mumbling that he would protect the group. He also mumbled that he saw a man in a black hat and cloak carrying a sickle. He told Stephen, if man doesn't straighten up, then the end will come soon. He also said, "There's a man here now who can save the world." Stephen said that he could hear his name, Stephen, being called from inside the woods. He then collapsed and Stephen's glasses fell off. Now, here is what Dr. Schwartz was told by Stephen during a psychiatric interview. And Dr. Schwartz, I should say, believed that Stephen was mentally sound, was very intelligent, not very well educated, but a very intelligent person.
Mm-hmm.
So he had a very high opinion of him. And Dr. Schwartz reports Stephen saying this: "Was it a dream? I heard a crying noise. I could see a man in a black robe carrying a scythe. Behind this man was fire, and in front of him was a force. And in this force were the creatures. They were calling, 'Stephen, Stephen.' One was laughing. It was a tantalizing laugh and making me mad. My hands were clenched tight. Behind us was a big light. In this light was something telling me to go forward. Go forward. Come on. It was edging me on. I could see myself as crazy, as a man so powerful that I wasn't scared of anything. The creatures kept calling me, and the light kept saying, go, my son, you can't be hurt. I think of a mother sheep calling her little lambs. As I walked to the edge of the woods, the creatures kept wailing. I looked at them, and all I could think of was death and the faceless form in the black robe who was commanding these things to kill me. It was hate, a hatred for everything. I knew that these things came from this force, and if they got to the light, they would be destroyed. The tension was so terrific that I passed out. Then I heard, he's here, he's here. But who is he? Somebody was putting a puzzle in my head. My hands and ankles were hurting. Somebody was telling me that these people are going to destroy themselves. I kept seeing the date 1976, 1976. It popped out of my mouth. If these people don't straighten out, the whole world will burn. So here you have a UFO sighting that turns into a Bigfoot sighting.
Oh, wow.
With physical creatures. The tracks were found at the scene. Creatures that interacted physically with the environment, but were impervious to gunshots. And then it morphs into this sort of full-blown, almost like a psychic possession.
Yeah, like some
situation.
telepathy or something is going on there too.
Yeah, so it's just and Dr. Schwartz was never able to resolve, he said it would be so much simpler if I could say that this young man was psychotic or delusional, but he felt these were real events, and he was describing exactly what he'd experienced.
Yeah, that's huge. And this is something too, Sarah. I mean, I'm curious to see like how you would hear a story like that in the light of just the history of your family, that someone having an experience like that would really impact what they view about the world in regards to everything, the nature of reality, even spirituality as well too, especially if you have maybe, I don't know what point of reference he had to Bigfoot or UFOs prior to this encounter, but even after that would probably really affect who he is. So you kind of see the level in which this is an encounter that seems to have both the physical and something supernatural going on. Like what comes to mind when you hear an encounter like that?
I mean, that definitely has a supernatural component to it. Like, this guy is claiming that this experience happened to him. Obviously, it was very traumatic and profound. That's definitely going to shape the way that he views the world, his worldview ultimately. But it's fascinating.
And he was, prior to this happening, he had absolutely no belief or no interest in the whole topic of UFOs, Bigfoot, strange creatures. He was a very practical, down-to-earth sort of guy. Yeah. Who he worked on his parents' farm, and he also did coal mining in the area. So he had no interest in this whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what comes to my mind with that sort of thing is that, God says to test the spirits.
Right.
If anything, even if an angel of light comes down from heaven and proclaims a different gospel, we're to reject it. Mm-hmm. So obviously with something like that, that's not leading him to Christ. That's not leading him to know Jesus as a savior. I would venture to say that was something nefarious.
Yeah. And I think that's ultimately, you have to ask the question, when these encounters are happening, like what is being communicated in regards to spirituality? And I can tell you this, just in my experience, it typically is never Jesus is the Son of God. Repent and believe the gospel. Yeah. It usually is not the case, right? Is there any record of what happened to this young man after this encounter? I mean, after he gave this testimony? Because this is life altering just from everything that I'm taking from this.
He went on to lead a fairly normal, mundane, unremarkable life. This was just an odd interlude in his life. He had been raised Roman Catholic.
Okay.
His wife, he was married at the time, was Protestant. not particularly devout, or, I would say they were nominally Christian, but would I have no idea what their status of their salvation might have been, but they were familiar enough with Christianity to recognize that Jesus was the Son of God.
Okay.
But nothing untoward or further from this man.
Okay. Well, even that's phenomenal as we wrap up part 1 here, is that I think it's interesting because of the fact that most of the time when you go on to like if you look up Amazon Prime or even a lot of the content in regards to Bigfoot, you have the people that are already very familiar with it and are looking for some sort of encounter, but they're just following they're on the cusp. They're like trying to find all these little clues like here and there, and they're intentionally looking for it. This is a guy who has no interest in it whatsoever. And even like I mentioned afterwards, he just kind of moves on with his life and just goes there. So it just kind of goes to show it is kind of interesting too, in regards to just, this whole conversation. Here's a guy who's not looking for it, finds it, and leads to a relatively normal life. When you have other times when people will just find out about it, or they'll have that inclination, that longing just to get a grasp of something of the unknown, and it becomes part of their identity and their obsession. So I don't know, it's kind of interesting because there's both sides of the equation. So so we hope you all enjoy the first part of this conversation. Again, this is just a very introductory overview. We're just having some fun today. It's sort of at the end of the year, it's kind of putting together this fun conversation. There'll definitely be some opportunities to unpack this. There's lots of other podcasts that go super in depth, but this is just a general overview and just some fun episodes we're doing. So we're going to wrap up part 1 here. We'll kind of jump into some other interesting topics in part 2. So, Ray, thank you for hanging out with us in this first episode. And Sarah, this was also awesome.
Thank you.
I'm sure you had a lot of fun. We're going to have some fun too in part 2. And as always, we appreciate you guys listening. And please share, talk to us on our social media. Let us know what you thought about this episode. And as always, a program like this cannot continue without your support. We are in a brand new year of 2022. We have a lot we have in store. We'd ask that you prayerfully consider partnering with us as we head into a brand new year of ministry and a lot of interesting and challenging topics we do want to explore. Excuse me. So please go to thecultishtshow.com. There's a donate tab. You can donate one time or become a monthly partner with us. And with all that being said, we'll talk to you guys next time on Cultish, where we enter into the kingdom of the cults and the fringe and the occult and all that crazy stuff. Talk to you guys soon.